After an argument, my son left me at a bus stop with no money. A blind gentleman whispered, "Pretend you're my wife. My driver is coming. Your son will regret leaving you." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as I watched Daniel's car disappear around the corner, the screech of tires on asphalt, a final punctuation to our argument. At 67, I never imagined I'd be standing abandoned at a bus stop, my own son driving away in anger. "I'm not a child, Daniel," I had told him, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. "I don't need you arranging my life as if I'm incompetent." His response had been predictably dismissive. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. That senior living facility is perfect. They have activities, medical staff, everything you need. Everything except my independence," I'd countered. That's when he'd pulled over abruptly. "Fine. If you're so independent, find your own way home. Maybe that will make you realize you need help." Only after his car disappeared did I discover my predicament. My purse, containing my wallet and bus pass, sat on my kitchen counter where I'd left it in our rush to leave. My cell phone, which I'd grabbed at the last minute, showed just 3% battery remaining. I felt a flush of humiliation rise to my cheeks as I stood at the bus stop, a woman of my age with no way to get home. 5 years a widow, 30 years a teacher of literature, and now reduced to this, stranded by my only child who couldn't understand that living in that antiseptic prison of a retirement community would kill me faster than any physical ailment. The bus stop bench offered little comfort to my arthritic hip as I contemplated my options. I could walk, but my apartment was at least 4 miles away. I could ask a stranger to borrow a phone, but I'd need to swallow considerable pride. And who would I call? The few friends my age who still drove wouldn't see a message for hours, and calling Daniel was out of the question. Lost in these thoughts, I hardly noticed when someone sat beside me until a cultured male voice spoke quietly. "Pardon me, but I couldn't help overhearing your predicament." I turned to find an elegant man in his early 70s sitting next to me. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes, and a white cane rested against the bench beside him. He was impeccably dressed in what my late husband would have called old money attire, a perfectly tailored light gray suit that managed to look comfortable despite the summer heat. "I'm fine, really," I said automatically, embarrassment coloring my voice. How much had he heard? A slight smile crossed his face. "I may be blind, but my hearing is excellent. Your son left you here without ensuring you had transportation home. That strikes me as inconsiderate." There was something about his direct assessment that bypassed my defenses. "That's one word for it," I admitted. "Another might be cruel." He angled his face toward me, his expression serious. "Pretend you're my wife," he said in a lower voice. "My driver is coming. Your son will regret leaving you like this." I blinked, taken aback by the unexpected offer. "I couldn't possibly." "I'm Robert Wilson," he continued smoothly, extending his hand with surprising accuracy toward mine. "And you are?" "Martha Collins," I replied, automatically, taking his hand. His grip was warm and firm. "Well, Martha Collins, I'm offering you a dignified solution to an undignified situation. No strings attached." He tilted his head slightly. "Unless you're uncomfortable accepting help from a blind old man?" Something in his self-deprecating tone made me smile despite everything. "Being blind doesn't make you incapable, Mr. Wilson. Just as being older doesn't make me incapable, despite what my son believes." He laughed then, a genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes above his dark glasses. "Touché, Mrs. Collins. Then we understand each other." Before I could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver, a distinguished-looking man about my age, stepped out and approached us. "Right on time, James," Robert said, gathering his cane. "We'll be giving Mrs. Collins a ride home today." If James found this unusual, he didn't show it. "Of course, sir," he responded with a slight nod in my direction. "Ma'am." As James helped Robert to the car with practiced efficiency, I hesitated. I'd spent my life being cautious, sensible. Getting into cars with strangers, even elegant blind gentlemen with chauffeurs, wasn't something Martha Collins did. And yet, as my phone finally died with a sad little beep in my pocket, I found myself making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Thank you," I said, allowing James to open the rear door for me. The interior of the car was cool and smelled of leather and subtle cologne. "Where do we have the pleasure of taking you, Mrs. Collins?" Robert asked as James started the engine. I gave my address in the modest East Side neighborhood where I'd moved after selling our family home following Frank's death. Actually, Robert said after a moment's consideration, I hope you'll allow me to offer you tea first. My home is nearby, and after such an eventful afternoon, you might appreciate a moment to collect yourself before returning home. The proper response would have been to decline politely. Instead, I found myself considering what awaited me at my apartment. Empty rooms and the lingering echo of Daniel's frustrated voice, the weight of the day's humiliation pressed down on me. Tea would be lovely, I heard myself say. As we drove through increasingly upscale neighborhoods, I studied Robert Wilson more carefully. His silver hair was expertly cut, his hands manicured but strong. The blindness seemed to have done little to diminish his confident bearing. There was something almost theatrical in the precision of his movements, the way he turned his head when I spoke, how his expressions matched my tone perfectly. If you're wondering if you've made a terrible mistake accepting a ride from a stranger, he said suddenly, as if reading my thoughts, I assure you James has an impeccable driving record, and I'm far too old and respectable to be dangerous. I found myself chuckling. I was actually thinking you seem remarkably well adjusted for someone who can't see. Ah, he replied with a small smile. Well, one adapts, or one becomes bitter. I chose the former. When the car finally pulled through an ornate gate and up a curved driveway, I couldn't suppress a gasp. Robert Wilson's home was nothing short of a mansion, a stunning colonial revival with perfectly manicured grounds stretching in every direction. Welcome to my humble abode, Robert said with a hint of irony in his voice. I hope you like Earl Grey. The grandeur of Robert Wilson's humble abode left me momentarily speechless as James helped us from the car. The mansion stood 3 stories tall, its symmetrical facade featuring elegant columns and expansive windows that caught the late afternoon sun. Flower gardens bloomed in carefully orchestrated color patterns, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the gentle splash of a fountain. Your silence suggests either you're admiring the view or reconsidering the wisdom of having tea with a stranger, Robert commented as we approached the front entrance. It's a bit overwhelming, I admitted. You didn't mention you lived in a palace. His lips quirked upward. Hardly a palace, though I suppose it is rather large for one person and a small staff. The family has owned it for generations, and I find comfort in familiar surroundings, especially since losing my sight. As James opened the massive front door, I noticed something curious. Despite Robert's apparent blindness, there were no obvious accommodations for a visually impaired person. No textured pathways, no specially marked doorways. Everything was simply beautiful, designed for sighted appreciation. The house doesn't seem particularly adapted for, I hesitated, for a blind man? Robert finished for me. I prefer aesthetic beauty over practicality. I've memorized every inch of this place. 15 years without sight teaches one to map spaces quite efficiently. We entered a foyer with soaring ceilings and a grand staircase that curved upward like something from a classic film. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting rainbow prisms across marble floors. We'll take tea in the garden room, Robert told James, and perhaps some of those lemon biscuits Mrs. Chen made yesterday. Very good, sir, James replied, before disappearing down a hallway. Robert offered his arm with surprising accuracy. Shall we? The garden room offers a pleasant view of the east grounds, or so I'm told. I hesitated before taking his arm, struck again by how confident he seemed for someone who couldn't see. As we walked through the house, I noticed subtle details, the way he occasionally trailed his fingers along certain surfaces, how he counted steps under his breath between rooms. The garden room proved to be a sunlit conservatory with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking immaculately landscaped grounds. Comfortable wicker furniture with plush cushions created several seating areas among large potted plants. The effect was both grand and intimate, wealth displayed without ostentation. Please, make yourself comfortable, Robert said, gesturing to a seating arrangement near the windows. He settled himself in an adjacent chair with practiced ease, placing his cane carefully beside him. Have you lived here long? I asked, trying to reconcile this palatial home with the man before me. All my life, with a few intervals away for education and business, he replied. Though I've closed off portions of it since losing my sight, no point maintaining rooms I'll never see again. There was a wistfulness in his tone that touched me unexpectedly. I downsized after my husband died. I offered. Our family home felt too empty with just me rattling around in it. Frank, wasn't it? Your husband's name? I blinked in surprise. Yes, but I don't remember mentioning you were wearing a wedding band but referred to yourself as Mrs. Collins, not Miss. And you mentioned your son, so I made an educated guess, Robert explained smoothly. Was it a long marriage? 42 years, I replied. High school sweethearts, if you can believe such a cliché. He was an engineer. Heart attack took him 5 years ago. My condolences. A significant loss. James returned with a tea service that would have impressed the Queen. Delicate china, silver serving pieces, and an array of small sandwiches and biscuits arranged on tiered plates. Will there be anything else, sir? James asked after setting everything before us. No, thank you, James. We'll manage. Robert waited until James had left before speaking again. Now then, Martha Collins, former teacher, literature, I would guess from your speech patterns, widow, mother to at least one controlling son. Tell me why he left you stranded today. My hand froze midway to the teacup. How did you? Teachers have a particular way of expressing themselves, precise vocabulary, complete sentences even in casual conversation. You mentioned being older, but not incapable, suggesting retirement. The rest I heard at the bus stop. His smile was gentle. I may be blind, but I'm far from unobservant. As he poured tea with surprising dexterity, I found myself telling Robert about Daniel's increasingly insistent campaign to move me into assisted living, how he'd arranged today's tour without consulting me, presenting it as a fait accompli, the argument that had escalated in the car afterward, culminating in my impulsive demand to be let out. You were asserting your independence, Robert nodded, and he responded by attempting to prove your dependence. Exactly. The validation from this stranger was unexpectedly powerful. Daniel doesn't see the irony. He claims I can't manage on my own, then abandons me without transportation to teach me a lesson about needing help. Children often struggle to see their parents as autonomous beings, Robert observed, sipping his tea. My daughter, Sophia, went through a similar phase after my sight deteriorated. She wanted to manage everything. My medical care, my business interests, my daily routine. It took time for her to understand that blindness hadn't diminished my competence. The tea was perfectly brewed, the sandwiches delicate and flavorful. As we continued talking, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't for months. Robert was an attentive listener and a thoughtful conversationalist, drawing connections between my experiences, teaching adolescence, and his navigating the business world. I founded a technology company specializing in security systems, he explained when I asked about his career. Ironic that I now can't see the very screens our software protects. Something about that statement struck me as odd, but before I could analyze it further, the door opened and a striking woman in her early 40s entered. Dad? James mentioned you had a guest. She stopped short upon seeing me, surprise evident in her expression. Sophia. Perfect timing, Robert said, turning his head in her direction. This is Martha Collins. Martha, my daughter Sophia Wilson. Sophia recovered quickly, extending a perfectly manicured hand. How lovely to meet you. Dad rarely entertains these days. Her tone was friendly but evaluative, her gaze taking in my simple dress and practical shoes with subtle assessment. I recognized the protective calculation in her eyes, the same look I'd given Frank's elderly aunts when they visited after his retirement. Your father rescued me from a rather awkward situation, I explained, briefly recounting my abandonment at the bus stop. Something in Sophia's face softened. That sounds exactly like something Dad would do. She glanced at her father with a mixture of exasperation and fondness, always collecting strays. Martha is hardly a stray, Robert countered. She's a retired literature teacher with a son who needs remedial education in respecting his mother's autonomy. Sophia laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her professional demeanor. Well, then you're in good hands. Dad has strong opinions about autonomy. She checked her watch. I can't stay. Board meeting in 30 minutes. Will you be at the foundation dinner tomorrow night? Wouldn't miss it, Robert replied. After Sophia departed with a quick kiss to her father's cheek, Robert tilted his head slightly. My daughter, he said with mock conspiracy, thinks I need constant supervision. The blindness makes her nervous, even after all these years. I studied him carefully, something about his demeanor nagging at me. She seems lovely, protective, but that's natural. Indeed. Robert set down his teacup with precision. Now, Shall we arrange to get you home before your son sends out a search party? James drove me home. As the evening shadows lengthened across the city, Robert insisted on accompanying me, saying something about completing the rescue properly. We sat side by side in the luxurious back seat, close enough that I could detect the subtle scent of his cologne, something expensive and understated with notes of sandalwood. Your son will likely be worried by now, Robert remarked as we turned onto my street. I checked my watch and sighed. It's been 3 hours since he left me. He's either frantic or still fuming. My apartment building came into view, a modest but well-maintained complex where most residents were retirees like myself. Nothing like the palatial estate we'd just left, but it was home. There's a car parked in front of your building. Dark blue sedan, man pacing beside it, Robert observed casually. I squinted through the windshield. That's Daniel. Then I froze, turning to look at Robert sharply. How did you... The car stopped, and Robert's hand found mine with unerring accuracy. Martha, would you indulge me in a small performance? He asked, ignoring my unfinished question. I'd like your son to witness your return. Understanding dawned slowly. You want him to see me arriving in a chauffeur-driven luxury car with a wealthy companion. Precisely. His smile held a hint of mischief that made him suddenly appear younger. A small lesson in presumptions, perhaps. I should have refused. It was childish, really, a petty revenge. But I thought of Daniel's dismissive tone, the way he'd driven off leaving me stranded, his absolute certainty that I couldn't manage without him. What did you have in mind? I asked. Robert's plan was simple. James would open my door with formal deference. Robert would exit with my assistance, playing up his blindness slightly. I would make introductions, and Robert would express delight at finally meeting my son, perhaps mentioning our plans for the coming week. Nothing explicitly false, Robert assured me. Just enough to make him reconsider his assumptions about your capabilities and connections. As James pulled up behind Daniel's car, I saw my son turn, his expression transitioning from worry to confusion at the sight of the luxury vehicle. His eyes widened as James emerged to open my door with a formal Mrs. Collins that carried clearly in the evening air. I stepped out, conscious of Daniel watching, and turned to assist Robert as we'd planned. He emerged with dignified care, dark glasses in place, his hand finding my arm with the practiced touch of someone accustomed to navigating the world without sight. Mom! Daniel hurried over, relief and bewilderment battling across his features. I've been calling for hours. Your phone... Died, I supplied calmly. The battery was nearly gone when you left me at the bus stop. He had the grace to look ashamed, his eyes darting between me and Robert, clearly trying to make sense of the scene before him. Daniel, I'd like you to meet Robert Wilson, I said with deliberate formality. Robert, my son Daniel. A pleasure, Robert said, extending his hand in Daniel's general direction. I've heard so much about you. Daniel shook his hand automatically, professional instincts kicking in despite his confusion. I can't say the same. Mom hasn't mentioned you. We only just met today, I explained, watching realization dawn in Daniel's eyes as he noticed the white cane and dark glasses, after I found myself unexpectedly at a bus stop without transportation. The implication hung in the air between us. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Wilson kindly offered me a ride home, and we discovered a mutual interest in early American literature. I continued smoothly. He's invited me to a foundation dinner tomorrow evening. Foundation dinner? Daniel echoed. The Wilson Family Foundation, Robert clarified. We provide funding for arts education and accessibility programs. Martha's experience as an educator offers valuable perspective. I watched my son reassessing the situation, his marketing executive mind visibly recalculating based on new data. The car, the driver, the foundation, the unmistakable signs of wealth that Robert carried effortlessly. That's wonderful, Daniel managed. Mom has always been passionate about education. Indeed, Robert replied, her insights on making literature accessible across generations are particularly relevant to our current initiatives. He turned slightly toward me. Until tomorrow, then? James will collect you at 6. I look forward to it, I replied, playing my part with perhaps too much enjoyment. Robert's hand found mine, raising it briefly to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that seemed perfectly natural coming from him. The pleasure was entirely mine, Martha. As James helped Robert back into the car, Daniel stood frozen beside me, visibly processing what he was witnessing. The sleek vehicle pulled away with a quiet purr, leaving us alone on the sidewalk. "Mom," Daniel began carefully, "who exactly is Robert Wilson?" "A gentleman who understood that my age doesn't define my competence," I replied, retrieving my keys from my pocket and heading toward the building entrance. Daniel followed, still struggling to align this new information with his existing perception of his mother. "How did you... when did I meet a wealthy, cultured man who values my company and opinions?" I glanced back at him. "About 20 minutes after you drove away and left me stranded." Inside my apartment, Daniel paced while I put on the kettle for tea, a far simpler affair than the service at Robert's mansion, but comforting in its familiarity. "I was worried sick," Daniel finally said. "When you weren't home and your phone went straight to voicemail, I checked the hospitals, Mom. That must have been frightening for you," I acknowledged, measuring tea leaves into my favorite pot. "Almost as frightening as being abandoned without transportation or sufficient funds." He winced. "I was angry. I shouldn't have left you there." "No, you shouldn't have," I agreed, my voice firm but not unkind. "Just as you shouldn't make decisions about my living arrangements without consulting me first." Daniel sank onto my sofa, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of his father that my irritation softened slightly. "I'm worried about you living alone, Mom. The stairs in this building, the distance from my family, your arthritis getting worse, all legitimate concerns," I said, bringing our tea to the coffee table, "which we could discuss as equals, rather than you making pronouncements about what's best for me as if I were a child, like that senior facility today." "Exactly like that." Daniel studied me over his teacup. "So, Robert Wilson, he seemed impressive." I couldn't help smiling at the transparent attempt to extract information. "He is. And you're having dinner with him tomorrow?" "With him and his foundation board, yes." My son hesitated. "I'm sorry I left you at that bus stop. It was childish and cruel." "Yes, it was," I agreed, then reached over to pat his hand. "But it led to an unexpected adventure. Perhaps we should both remember that I'm still capable of those." After Daniel left, with multiple apologies and a promise to discuss, not dictate, future plans, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying the events of this extraordinary day. One detail continued to nag at me: Robert's comment about Daniel's car. How had a blind man known its color, or that someone was pacing beside it? And there had been other moments, the way he'd navigated his home with too much precision, how he'd noticed my wedding band, his perfectly aimed gestures, small inconsistencies that together formed a pattern I couldn't quite decipher. As I prepared for bed, my phone, now recharged, chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "I hope our small performance provided satisfactory results. Looking forward to tomorrow's dinner. Sleep well. RW." I stared at the screen, wondering exactly what sort of man I'd actually met today, and why the prospect of seeing him again filled me with such unexpected anticipation. I spent the following morning distracted, my thoughts repeatedly returning to Robert Wilson and the peculiar inconsistencies in his behavior. While watering my modest collection of houseplants, I found myself analyzing our interaction with the same critical attention I once applied to complex literary texts with my students. A blind man who noticed a blue car and a pacing figure from a moving vehicle, who poured tea with perfect precision, whose home lacked the tactile modifications one would expect, who texted me directly rather than having his assistant do so. The obvious conclusion seemed impossible: that Robert Wilson, wealthy philanthropist, was not actually blind. But if that were true, why maintain such an elaborate deception? What purpose could it possibly serve? At noon, a delivery arrived, an elegant box containing a handwritten note in flowing script. "For this evening's foundation dinner, I took the liberty of having Sophia select something appropriate.